told you, my name is Oscar Pichardo, and I am a Pedro Pan child. And what I'm going to try to do tonight here is I'm going to give you a presentation, and I'm going to give you a little flavor of what Pedro Pan was about. We're going to go through an overview of time phrasing, Cuba 1958. I'm going to speak very briefly about a controversial subject, the CIA and Patria Potestad. Then I'm going to tell you about Operation Pedro Pan, how it started in Cuba, Miami, what was going on in Cuba from 1959 to 1962. Then I'm going to tell you about the unaccompanied Cuban children's program, and then I'm going to give you a personal perspective on what it was like living in Cuba from 1958 through 61, 62, and going through the camps and being a Pedro Pan. So we'll take off now. Okay, everything that in my presentation, everything here, these are all the different sources that I use and I have used through the years for Pedro Pan. Everything in there is everything that is on the paper is through a source. If I misspeak, it's my fault because I'm not perfect, but everything is a source and it's been verified. Okay, so Pedro Pan, what is it? Well, I'm going to speak through the presentation. The Pedro Pan basically was the efforts of the Cuban parents. They were very concerned about what was going on in Cuba, very concerned about the limitation of freedoms, self-determination, and becoming basically indoctrinated in Marxist Leninism and communism. So through a series of events that happened, Pedro Pan was basically the largest child refugee movement in the Western Hemisphere. It began on December 26, 1960, when the first children arrived, ended abruptly in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Over 14,000 minors came to the U.S. under this operation, as it was called, and that included the youth from all corners of the island, basically mostly middle-class and lower middle-class youth, but all over, mostly Catholics, since it was done to the auspices of the Catholic Church, but there were Jewish kids, there were Protestant kids, agnostics, and even some LDS I have found. Basically, Pedro Pan was coined by a reporter in Miami. They did not want to say what was going on with all these kids, so the reporter, his name was Gene Miller, came up with the name, and the first time it was used in public was in 1962 in an article he wrote when it was no longer possible to maintain secrecy of the number of Cuban children all around, not only Florida, but all over the United States. So basically, Operation Pedro Pan, we all call ourselves Pedro Pan, but it was basically composed of two different components. One was the actually getting out of Cuba, exiting Cuba through the visa waiver or student visa program. The other was once you got to the United States, you had to have a place where you could live. So that's the two components of Pedro Pan. Okay, Mr. James Baker was actually responsible for setting up the Pedro Pan net, if you would, in Cuba. And he was responsible for being the issuing of the visa waivers and all the documentation required to get out of Cuba. And Monsignor Walsh, it was then Father Walsh, he was through Catholic Welfare Bureau. He took care of the well-being of the kids once they arrived in the United States. See, there's a misconception about what Cuba was in 1958. Cuba was not a third world country. It was not an underdeveloped nation. Actually, Cuba had a very high standard of living as it went in the world at that time. And in particular, this is a quote from Richard Fagan in his book that Cuba was definitely not far from an underdeveloped country, and it ranked in many aspects, it was among the leaders of the world. It is a misconception that has been perpetuated, and these are just some numbers, and basically they're statistics taken from different sources, all legit, where Cuba ranked in things like, public education, literacy, female students, and I'm not going to go through them. I'm just trying to show you that, I'm trying to dispel the myth that Cuba, all there was about Cuba was prostitution and casinos. And it's personally, as a Cuban, and I know in the Cuban community, it is something that we find this, if you would, a myth that all Cuba was in 1958 was prostitution, casinos, and that everything was horrible before. Wasn't great, there were things wrong with it, but it was not a third world country. It was a very developed country with a large middle class. Okay, a little bit about what happened in 1958. You know, Castro was, he was one of the many groups that were in Cuba at the time making the revolution or unhappy with the Batista government. Castro had a well-known reputation within Cuba, kind of, if you would, as he was a loser. And these items are here, I'm just showing them to illustrate the fact that Castro was not this angel that he was portrayed to be. He was not deemed the savior. It was a very big development in 1957 when Herbert Matthews of the New York Times interviewed him in the mountains. This was like a few short months after he had landed. He was in dire straits, and the man really actually created a legend at that time. There's a book called The Man Who Invented Fidel by Anthony De Palma, which is an excellent accounting of what happened during that. Let's see. The quote is from Monsignor Walsh, and basically what he said is, hey, you know, sometimes things happen, and you know, they may be political and they may be motivated for whatever reason, but in the end, it turns out to be a good thing. And that's Monsignor Walsh quote in 1998. There has been a huge, let's call it a misinformation campaign by people who are either apologists or sympathizers of the regime, that basically the only reason why Operation Pedro Pan came about was because of a rumor created by the CIA. Let's see. I'm basically here, you know, they always say follow the money trail. Well, in 1998, the CIA was told, hey, you know, you guys are spending a lot of money looking for documents. What the heck is going on? So this is kind of the response to the request. For the first one was a conference at the National Security Archives, and Edmund Cohen said, hey, you know, we get blamed for everything. And one of the things that we get blamed on is Operation Pedro Pan. We're falsely accused of instigating the exodus of Cuban children. Follow up on that, Mr. Mosman, the Director of Congressional Affairs of the CIA, was tasked by the Chairman of the House of Representatives Permanent Select Committee as to explain what was he expending all this money on and what was going on. The CIA has a task to declassify documents, so they were spending a lot of time. So this is the report that Mr. Mosman gave to the Honorable Porter Goss. Basically, they had a search for Pedro Pan, which was the result of a lawsuit, Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, and the CIA was directed by the U.S. federal court, to find all the documentation on Pedro Pan. They spent 1,500 man-hours and came up with one document that was declassified and released. So, next, a couple of years later, in Oye magazine, CIA spokesman went on the record also stating basically what it says here. Hey, you know, we looked at it, we found some stuff, we declassified it, we sent it out, there was nothing going on, CIA was not involved, and you know, it's kind of like trying to make the point that the CIA, perhaps they had knowledge of the operation or not, but this was not a CIA concocted operation. This was something that came through in response to the Cuban parents' need and fear for their kids to get them out of the country. The other item that creates a little controversy is the supposedly patria potestad, which basically it means parental custody. There is a back and forth whether there was a law that was going to be instigated or it was actually something, a rumor started by anti-Castro people. Basically, it's unclear, and the bottom line is it really doesn't matter. Okay. The first quote is from Lenin. Revolution is impossible as long as a family exists. And the other quotes are from Julie M. Bunk in a study she did on revolutionary Cuba in the 70s. Basically, the whole deal about Patria Potestad, the fact that Castro and the regime wanted to take over the kids, they wanted to indoctrinate them, they wanted to control all the education, all that. Those are the facts. So basically, perhaps there was a law, perhaps there wasn't a law, but the bottom line is that was the intent of the regime anyway. And that's also one of the main drivers why the parents decided on sending the kids to the United States by themselves. So I'm going to ask if there's any questions at this point before we go on. And, okay. Operation Pedro Pan, Cuba. This is Mr. James Baker. Mr. James Baker was the headmaster at Russell Academy. He had been in Cuba for a long time. Russell Academy was a prestigious, he actually won the only Russell Academy, if I remember correctly. He inherited it when the original owner, Mr. Rustin, passed away. There was a, it was a very prestigious school for children who wanted to learn. It was late in 1960. Some of these prominent Cubans came to him and said, Mr. Baker, look, we need you to get a scholarship for our kids because we need to get them out of the country. And Mr. Baker said, well, you know what, it's the wrong time of the year. I can't get you scholarships now, but I'll see what I can do. The concern was, the parents were concerned. They were involved in anti-Castro's activities. And the concern was that if they were imprisoned or something happened to them, what would happen to the kids, or whether the kids would be, if they had to go into hiding, if the kids would be used as hostages. That was the concern. Understanding this concern, Mr. Baker went to Miami in December to meet with the Havana American Chamber of Commerce, and while he was there in a bunch of meetings, he was steered to meet Father Walsh. Basically, and as we'll see in the next set of slides, he met with Father Walsh and discovered that they were both seeking a solution to basically the same problem, which was unaccompanied Cuban children. And they reached an agreement, and the deal was Mr. Baker would furnish the list to the American Embassy and to Monsignor, or then Father Walsh, of the kids that were going to come to the United States under student visas at the time. And Father Walsh would be waiting for the children in arriving in Miami. On December the 15th, Mr. Baker returned to Cuba on about December 12th, and on the 15th, the first list of unaccompanied children that are going to come to the United States was received in Miami. On December 26th, the first two children of Operation Pedro Pan, and that's generally considered to be the quote-unquote birth of Operation Pedro Pan. The first two children arrived in Miami. They were a brother and a sister. On January 3rd, diplomatic relations were broken between the two countries. Embassies were closed in Havana. The U.S. Embassy was closed in Havana. Therefore, student visas would be able to be used to get the children into the United States. On January 4th, Mr. Baker and Mrs. Baker leave Cuba and arrive in Miami. Mr. Baker and Father Walsh worked to find a solution to the problem, and one of the workarounds, there was two workarounds actually implemented. One was to try to get the State Department to allow Monsignor Walsh to issue visa waivers. The second was a plan to bring the children to the U.S. via Jamaica, and we'll see a little bit more on that later. Before leaving Cuba, Mr. Baker had organized a committee to distribute the documentation required to leave Cuba. One of the things that was needed was a visa, and of course, a U.S. visa. The other was, plane ticket, and various other things. One of the things that I want to stress here is, it is not sometimes emphasized enough that in order to leave Cuba, you needed an exit permit from the government. And later on, we'll see part of the reason why you needed an exit permit. But you could not just decide to say, I'm leaving Cuba. You had to go and apply. And it did not matter where you were going, whether you were going to come to the United States to stay or anywhere you go. you had to go to the government and say, hey, by the way, I'm planning on taking a trip wherever. You needed an exit permit to be able to leave the island. The original committee comprised of these illustrious people, for which I am eternally grateful for their efforts, and they were all the initial. It grew, but what became Operation Pedro Pan grew quite a bit from here, and there were other names that are thrown out that are very prominent, like the Graus, Polita, and Mongo Grau. But these were the, in the words of Mr. Baker, these were the people that he originally recruited, and this was the beginning of the net of distribution for the documentations for Cuba. You hear me call him Father or Monsignor. He was Father at the time. I believe he became a Monsignor sometime around 1962. But he was the gentleman, or sorry, Father. He was a priest responsible for the feeding care of the kids when they came to Miami, the United States. The Operation Pedro Pan. One hell of a man. Okay, so how did Monsignor Walsh get involved in this? This is true stories. On November 15th, a 15-year-old Cuban boy was brought into his office. Legend has it that his name was Pedro. Yeah, you can believe it or not. 200 kids at the time, little did they know. And basically the reason he was there and spoke to Monsignor Walsh was these people were active in the underground, anti-Castro underground, and they were concerned for the safety of their children. So they agreed to work together to bring the children to the United States through student visas and keep this very quiet, because you really did not want the Castro government to know what was going on with the children. So this had to be done kind of very quietly. The break in the Cuba and the closing of the U.S. Embassy and that, and then there were no longer student visas available for the kids to come to the United States. Basically, at the time, there were 2 flights a week direct to Kingston, Jamaica, and then there were, I believe, 2 others that went to Jamaica, 2 or 3, through Miami and then to the class. And they were pretty much unhappy with what was going on in the Batista government. I mean, he wasn't the worst, he wasn't the best, but there was a lot of things that were going on wrong. People were tired of that, and they wanted to replace him. And unfortunately, replacing him, they kind of forgot who they were probably bringing in, and that's basically what Anthony De Palma said in his book, that they had no clear idea how to replace him. They just wanted to get rid of him and fill in the void, and the void was filled by, we all know whom. Okay, so I know that people find it very difficult to believe that parents would send their kids, and I want to say here that we were not given away, we were not shipped. I read an article in one of the presentations this summer that the Cuban parents gave their children away for adoption to the State Department. I mean, there was none of that. There was a lot of angst that this decision was performed under. It was not an easy decision for any creative divisions within families. Father, mother, brother, sister, uncles, aunts. It was a very harsh thing. What it did do, it accomplished one of the things that the Castro regime and any communist system wants to do, which was they tried to destroy the family unit. The family unit was very, very strong in Cuba. And it created a lot of angst for a lot of people and a lot of problems for a lot of people. This was not a very light decision. Part of the decision, when you look at Cuban history, through the years, even going back to the Spanish colonial period, it seemed like when there was a problem in Cuba, you didn't like the government, or you did something and the Spanish colonial government got on you, you fled to the United States. There was always a strong, in Key West, always a strong Cuban colony in Key West, in the Tampa area, and in another place up there called Ybor City, which is where they actually have a, where they make cigars up there that those people came from Cuba and created a sort of it was kind of like a two-way bridge. You left the island, you spent 2 or 3 years abroad in the United States, things changed, and boom, you went back. Yankees, get rid of anybody and everybody, let's take it over. The USSR in April, this is a very interesting bullet. In April of 1959, Fidel Castro was invited to the United States, to the United Nations, but also he was invited by the New York Press Club to come for a visit. It caught the administration, the Eisenhower administration, totally by surprise. The Eisenhower administration had no intention of inviting him or recognizing him in any way, shape, or form until they figured out exactly what was happening, because there was a lot of smoke out there. There was a lot of people saying, hey, you can't trust this guy. Anyway, so as he is in the United States, meeting with the press club and the United Nations, swearing up and down that he's not a communist, he's never been a communist, he's not going to do any of this stuff, he is in contact with the USSR, and he is in contact with the USSR specifically asking him how to set up an intelligence apparatus. That's what he was doing in April of 1959. Many of the apologists for the Cuban regime try to make the point that Castro was pushed to communism by the United States. Well, I don't think so. This is a fact, and it shows his inclinations from very early on that he was indeed, he had Marxist-Leninist inclinations, to say the least. Anyway, on with that one. Let's see. In May of '59, the agrarian reform, basically what it did is took the land. Yes, there were some wealthy landowners, there were some small landowners, but everybody lost their land. First, you start with the big folks, and then you keep going, and then pretty soon nobody's got any land left. Not even the small farmers. Everything was, you have to join the military. That's it. You join the military. Before that time, they had the youth patrols. They had come up with a clever idea for taking the kids out of schools and out of home, and basically it was like, hey, they try to say it was like Boy Scouts. Well, it was more than that. They marched around for hours on end, and it was always, nosiest neighbor on your block, with nothing to do for 24 hours a day, but watch what you were doing. Not only what you were doing, but who's coming into your home, who's coming out, who you were talking to, what you were doing, when you left for work, what you did. Whatever I'm telling you, speak to a Cuban who was at that time and ask him about the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, or the CDR. It was basically spying for the government. All the reports that were generated all went back into the central government to find out what you were doing and if you were a good revolutionary or not. I cannot tell you how difficult it is to live under these conditions on merit, when it was based on this party affiliation, loyalty to the regime. The kids were asked, things like, you've probably heard of it, it's true. They would say, close your eyes and ask God for ice cream. Nothing happened. Close your eyes and ask Fidel for ice cream. All of a sudden, they all had ice cream. You don't believe me? Ask any of the Cubans in this audience. This is not a lie. This is actually what was going on at the time. Basically, what they were trying to do is they were trying to limit educational opportunities to the people who were not based on merit, but to the people who were good projects. The people that you get over here. Let's see. Schools are closed. Teachers go revolutionary training. The curriculum. The summer of '61, 250 children, and they were anywhere from 4th graders through high school, are put into uniforms and sent to the countryside to teach reading and writing to the illiterate. Okay, they're gone. They're gone. The Minister of Education says nobody will be exempt. If you get picked, you go. There is no divergence from this. This is revolutionary doctrine, and no one gets those kids. In February of '61, the 2 first private schools are confiscated. 4 million are incarcerated. They're incarcerated for various periods of time without due process. You don't know where they are. wives that are looking for their husbands, husbands looking for their wives, looking for their children. Most of them are released from abortion. And you know, the government decrees that all the youth must join. Now it's, you know, not just youth patrol, but you know, up to 5 years old, you're in a circulo infantil, which is basically youth circle. Basically, it's supposed to be like a nursery, but once again, what it's doing is, you know, mandatory class. By doing that exchange of currency, it wipes out any wealth that anybody had accumulated. And this is not a lot of wealth. I mean, you know, these are not huge numbers. He just wipes out anybody and everybody who's got a little bit of money. And what it does is it makes you totally dependent now on the government. You know, took all your money away, they've already taken your property away. So now you better toe the line, and you have no room to wiggle now any way. You know, if you expel. The reason for the expelling of the clergy is because in September was the patron saint of Cuba, Our Lady, Nuestra Señora de la Caridad, Our Lady of Charity, and it was one of the last public displays of the Lady of Charity, and I would say a sort of a riot broke out between two factions, the religious faction, mostly anti-Catholic to anybody. But this is what's happening. This is what's happening. And it's very hard for us to comprehend how this can happen. But it did, and it does, and it's still going on. This is still going on to this day. So this is, when I mentioned what, you know, what our parents were going through and the decision our parents were making, these are the things that was weighing on our parents' mind at the time. That's a decision where at one point they decided, you know, we've got nothing to lose by sending our children overseas, but you know, maybe providing them with a good life and freedom, and hopefully we can follow them and join them and, you know, start all over again. And that's what many of our Cuban parents did. We already talked about it. It's, you know, that's a sad reality, and you know, was submit to the state or do something about it. And the only thing they could do at the time was, you know, they chose freedom, for which I am eternally grateful to my parents for having the guts and their conviction to send me to this country by myself. Hopefully that, you know, they were going to join me, and they did, and I was fortunate in that respect. But I saw my parents struggle, so I know what they went through. So basically, that's, you know, an incredible tale of love that you know, our parents and the decisions that they had to make to provide for our well-being. You know, I mean, that's more than I ever had to do for any of my children, and I certainly hope I never have to do anything like that for them. But that's what many Cuban parents, and not just Pedro Pan parents, but all Cubans who came to this country feeding Castro, they all have the same story. Ours just happens to be a little bit different. Okay, so now we know that why the children are leaving, why they're being sent here, and so now what happens when they get to the United States? Well, that's the Unaccompanied Cuban Children's Program. By the way, does anybody have any questions on any of those? Mr. Walsh actually received, I would say, good 60 to 65% of the kids when they arrived in Miami, their first contact with me. This is the link that I was mentioned before to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Approximately 700 kids had come, you know, which was a lot, but you know, it was manageable. You know, they were, you know, CWB was doing okay. They were finding places for them in like Montana. Yeah, heck of a place for a warm-blooded Cuban kid to wind up. You know, that's why I'm a cheesehead. You know, we were all over. We were all over. We went to where the homes were available. So Operation Pedro Pan comes to a close on October 22nd, 1962, and you know, it was a very scary time for a lot of Pedro Pans. If your parents weren't here, and I said thousands. The figures are thrown about, and I hate to throw them out. One of the things that the Johnson administration did do when they negotiated the agreement was the fact that all the parents of unaccompanied kids would get priority on those flights. Within 6 months, they went from whatever the backlog was down to 25 kids left behind. Uncategorically, no Pedro Pan was ever adopted. We were not put up for adoption. We did go to live with foster homes, with American families, and we maintained relationship with our families like they were, in some cases, our mother and father, our real family. But no Pedro Pan kid was ever adopted. And anybody that says that they were It's not true. That's a falsehood. No Pedro Pan kids were ever given up for adoption, and the Catholic Church just would not allow that to happen.
Yes. Children who aged to be adults while they were in the home and they still hadn't been reunited.
Once you turned 18, you sort of became independent. In many cases, they were facilitated with scholarships to go to school, Catholic education and that type of stuff. They weren't just kicked out the door, but you were expected to, carry your own weight. You were helped, you were guided, and see what you could do. But you did have to. You were no longer a ward of the state. You were out on your own. So, Monsignor Walsh. I love Monsignor Walsh. He's a great man. Was a great man. Okay, so the question is, he was often asked, and we're often asked, and it's thrown around, was Pedro Pan the right thing to do, separate the family? Monsignor Walsh's answer is, the problem which has existed in Cuba for years, people being obliged to be away from the family within the country, and immigration which has torn apart whole families and caused suffering for a large part of the population. The Cuban government, because of its ideological stance, has imposed and is still imposing these sufferings on the Cuban people. No one can deny that separation from one's family is always traumatic and painful. How could it be otherwise? However, at times it is necessary because it is the lesser of two evils. The real heroes of Pedro Pan were the parents who made the hardest decision that any parent can make. Thank you very much. I appreciate your thank you. James Baker, the man who created Operation Pedro Pan in Cuba, and I want to thank you for sharing that with me, the opportunity to the presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it. And it's always honoring your father is very special to us Pedro Pan.
Very much. I'd like to add two little things of historic interest. First of all, I think the question came up about the exit visas, and I think there was not the same problem getting exit visas for the unaccompanied minors. That was one of the most bizarre pieces of bureaucracy I've ever seen, because they managed to get these kids out of the country without going through the formal exit permit. The second thing was that you said that all these things were handled through the embassies. Just to give an example of the sacrifices. In the early days of the visa waiver program, since the American embassy no longer was in Cuba, and they had no established way of getting it back, the paperwork was carried by the pilots. KLM pilots, Pan Am pilots, carried the paperwork at risk to themselves. The third thing that I think is very important for people who are interested in this, and who may have heard other presentations, may have seen the movie, I think we have to remember something very important. Things don't always work out well. There were kids that came out who had a miserable existence for part or all of their lives. There were kids that were put in foster arrangements that were terrible. There are kids who rightfully can claim that their lives were ruined. And I think that is what some people play on, saying that this was a terrible program. But you've got to look at what's the proportions. On average, most of the kids who came through the program, when it was all said and done, most of them came back with families, if not their parents, their uncles, or people with whom they were close. And most of them ended up in positive situations, feeling positive about that. So the fact that you can find probably hundreds of people, out of many thousands, who say it was terrible, who give all sorts of bad examples, who badmouth the program, we've got to accept that. That happened. But it always happens. It happens with foster situations in this country with American kids. It happens with other immigrants who come in. So let's not pretend it didn't exist, but the people who are critical of the program just challenge and saying, yeah, it happened. Bad things always happen. But to how many people? And I think that to me is the most important thing in trying to keep this as a balanced perspective of what the program tried to achieve.
Thank you, Dr. Baker.
To let them know about the inventory, when people were leaving the country, what the government did.
With Stella, she's a Pedro Pan. She wants to share with, what did you tell her?
Well, what they did was that as soon as the family wanted to leave, the government would come into the house and inventory every single item that you owned, to the knife, to the fork, to a napkin. And they would keep that inventory with them. And when you were given the exit date, those same people would come back to the house and check that everything that was inventory back in 6 or a year ago is still there. If it was not there, you were denied the exit. And there were many people that were even at the airport, and at the last moment, they were told, oh no, you are missing a fork or whatever, you cannot leave. And they would deny it, and they, at the last moment they would have to rush and find somebody to replace that piece of item. So that was, again, the torture, that you never knew what was going to happen to the last moment that you were on the plane. And it was, you know, everything was left to the government. You couldn't give anything to your relatives. So all the heritage and whatever you owned, it was just given away. So
Take it back.
I'm very fascinated with it, about the story on the airplane that you were called in.
Yes.
What airline was this?
It was Pan Am.
Pan Am, so it was an American airline?
Yes, it was Pan Am.
Outstanding, thank you.
I just wanted to thank you
Yes.
for such an outstanding and accurate portrayal, and I'm proud to be your Pedro Pan brother and your friend.
That's my plant in the audience.
I have a.
Can you tell us about how you were reunited with your family and how?
Yeah, she asked how I was reunited with my family. Basically, my family arrived in June of 1962. They were in Florida, and they were pretty much told. Of course, my dad was, he was all going, hey, send my kids to me. I want my kids. I want to see my kids. So basically, what they told us, like, whoa, hold on there, buddy. Let's see, before we send your kids to you, you have to prove that you can take care of the kids. We don't want to send them to you and you become a problem in Florida, particularly Miami at that time when it was a large growing refugee population. We don't want to send you there and they become, public wards. So you have to have a job, you have to have a home, you have to prove that you can take care of your kids. Great insult to my father. I'll get to that later on. Anyway, so what happens is at that time they started a relocation program. They were starting to they wanted to move the people arriving from Cuba, the family units, out throughout the United States, especially sending them to areas where there was unemployment and they needed workers. So my dad wound up in Lawrence, Massachusetts. He got there in him and my parents and another Cuban family, the first 2 Cubans to arrive in Lawrence, Massachusetts, July 1962. So right away, through the International Rescue Institute, which had been very active, and I always get this screwed up. I think 56 was Czechoslovakia and 68 was Hungary, right? I think that's correct. Okay, 56 was Hungary, 68 was Czechoslovakia. Thank you, Dr. Brophy. Anyway, they had been active in relocating some of the refugees from Europe at that time, and they had a little mechanism there where they could bring them, house them for a while, help them get jobs and get them established, and that's exactly what happened with my family. They came, they stayed in a one-room apartment. They helped my father get a job at one of the many mills. Lawrence was a mill town, one of those towns created during the textile boom and shoe boom in the early part of the 20th century. Anyway, so my father was able to get a job, rented an apartment, Benz, the whole deal, most of it on credit, signed and everything. Anyway, so then, then he said, hey, I'm ready to receive my 2 sons, send them to me. So in September of 1962, my brother and I were reunited with our parents in Lawrence, Massachusetts. a funny story, and one that my dad died in 1974, much too early. But one of the stories that we always used to get my dad was he was completely chagrined because before my brother and I would be sent to him, he had to have an inspector from the Welfare Bureau come over and approve of the fact that he could take care of my brother and I again. And that to him, that was one of the biggest insults anybody would perpetrate on him. So whenever we wanted to get my dad to go, we would always go, what the heck, you had to have an inspector come over because you didn't know how to raise your kids. So that's a true story.